Professor Ryan Alford, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
Professor Alford, in the beginning of this book, you spent a lot of time talking about the rule of law. Why is that important, and how is it so difficult to understand this concept?
It's difficult to understand because it's a principle that's so foundational that we've taken it for granted, even for centuries. The United States was the first government explicitly founded on that principle, attempting to instantiate the principle that the government should be one of laws and not of men. So at its core, really quite a simple principle, the idea that everyone should be subject to the laws, and in particular that the president should be legally accountable. The problem, of course, is that it's very difficult to instantiate, and when it relies on a certain level of goodwill and an expectation that the political process will function correctly, those expectations are not really ones that we can take for granted anymore in the 21st century.
Now, you, of course, practiced in the United States, both in regional and domestic and international affairs. Why a book about the United States situation when there are so many other situations, including here in Canada, that might be of interest?
It's remarkable how the United States has projected its power across the world, and it's attempting to reshape international norms in its own image. Right now, the United States is conducting hostile interventions with its military in 7 different foreign nations. We very rarely speak about, for instance, the blockade of Yemen or American Special Forces operations in Somalia, but they're going on all the time. And as they conduct those operations, they're attempting to change international law to make what they do retroactively legal.
And we're saying in changing the law, they're changing their own constitution or circumventing it, or what exactly?
They're trying to develop doctrines that would allow the president to do whatever he wants to do with any kind of oversight from Congress or the courts, which is really quite shocking. What got me into this, I was involved in litigation along with the ACLU and the Center for Constitutional Rights, where an American citizen attempted to prevent the president of the United States from murdering him via drone strike. And the court in the District of Columbia said, I simply can't supervise this sort of question. It's a political question reserved to the president. So when someone is saying, I have a constitutional right not to be killed, and the courts say, well, I'm sorry, I can't adjudicate that because the president has decided that it's the appropriate course of action. You have to ask yourself, have we crossed some sort of fundamental threshold where we're now not even just in a problem of constitutional crisis, but really have we crossed over the normative order into a state of affairs that's no longer characterized by the rule of law?
Is this a situation where the president, in this case, for example, is somehow above the law because the law refuses to take a look at it?
It's the same sort of problem that brought about the rule of law in the first place. So in the 17th century, you had an English king saying, well, of course I'm subject to the law. In that case, it would be God's law. But no one can judge whether or not I'm in compliance with the law. So the United States has a situation where President Trump, he sometimes runs into problems because he'll say explicitly, I'm above the law. No one can stop me. The courts can't stop me. And then you have courts pushing back a little bit. You have Congress pushing back a little bit. But if in practice all he does is act as if he's above the law, the courts are quite willing to say, well, we're not fit to judge him. We're not fit to judge his conduct in foreign affairs or in defense of national security, and Congress does the same. So we have a practical situation that whenever he says, well, this is an exception, it relates to national security, everyone just acts as if he's above the law.
I'd like you to explain the title, Permanent State of Emergency, Unchecked Executive Power, and the Demise of the Rule of Law.
The demise of the rule of law is directly related to the creation of a permanent state of emergency. So after the 9/11 attacks in 2001, there was a sense in Washington that something had to be done. The president had to be given all these extensive powers to really get down to business. Dick Cheney once famously described that as having to work on the dark side. And they gave him that power with the idea that, well, this was a temporary crisis. We would deal with the terrorists who committed the 9/11 bombing. And now 16 years later, we have a civil war in Syria where there's an organization known as Liwa al-Sham, which is funded by the United States and given weapons by the United States, despite the fact that it is in fact the Syrian branch of al-Qaeda. So the categories have become so amorphous. The grant of power to the president to pursue whichever people he believes are his enemies at the moment has just been stretched so far that it can cover literally anyone. And I describe that in detail in the book. Groups like organizations in Somalia and Yemen are now being designated as the effective equivalent of the people who brought down the World Trade Center. And that's allowing for a permanent state of warfare, which people like James Madison said would destabilize the American presidency.
But haven't governments throughout history, modern history anyway, have given themselves excess power in a state of emergency? I mean, we had the War Measures Act, for example, in which the Canadian government, for example, in the Second World War, practically controlled everything. And, that was a state of emergency. And I'm just wondering, given the current political situation worldwide where we do have such incredible destability, I mean, is there not in some way a permanent state of emergency in a way? Because, I mean, you have these lone wolf attacks. You never know where it's coming from.
The problem is that rather than declaring war on a set of combatants or even a particular terrorist organization, we've declared a war on terror, which is kind of like declaring a war on drugs or a war on poverty. Terror is like the poor. It'll always be with us. If we give the president the power to continue as long as there's going to be some sort of terrorist threat, we're effectively saying, well, we need to abandon democratic governance. It was a failed experiment.
We have situations also, for example, the situation with Turkey, where the president has given himself extraordinary powers. Is there a thought in your mind that this idea of leaders acquiring more and more power, something that is sort of spreading? I mean, could it possibly happen in places like Canada, Britain, South Africa, Australia, anywhere else like that?
I do think so. I think that we should absolutely avoid complacency. It would have been unthinkable in the United States after the reconstruction of the rule of law post-Watergate that this would occur so quickly. There's a tremendous appetite in the public for just someone who can get things done, cut through all the problems of governance. And that person who comes forward like a strong man saying, I can solve all the nation's problems, is tremendously attractive. The problem is that it denigrates the political process to the point where, well, you have to ask yourself, do we believe in democracy at all? Right now, actually, a Supreme Court justice was speaking at a conference at the University of Montreal on Tuesday, and she gave us the statistic that 1 in 6 Americans state openly that they prefer that America be ruled by its military. And that's really quite shocking for a state founded on the principle that it should be a government of laws and not of men.
But in the case where there is an emergency of some kind, isn't it true that when you have a strong central power that they can get things done? Because you can't deal with an emergency with a committee, for example. There's just too much conflict of ideas and so on.
Certainly. I guess the question is whether or not the state of emergency is going to exist within the laws or whether or not it exists outside of the laws. So if you have a situation right now, for instance, Canada has the Emergencies Act that replaced the War Measures Act, Parliament can say, well, we really think that this emergency is over. But if you hand over all of the power to continue the emergency to one person, the most powerful person in the political system, who gains nothing by declaring that emergency over and gains everything by continuing it, it's going to be continued indefinitely, whether or not the particular conditions continue to exist. And then you have something like, I would say, Peronist Argentina, where you do in fact crush the opposition, but you're just so enamored with power that the state of emergency continues indefinitely.
Professor Ryan Alford, one of the cases you mentioned as an example is where preemptive action is taken. And again, I don't know how many people would disagree with the idea that let's take out this organization or that person before, because we know they will at some point, before they harm our people or our country.
Well, when you say that we know, usually that's we allege, or some faction in the government or the intelligence services alleges. You can comb through the records of CSIS and then before at the RCMP, National Security Service, and find all kinds of organizations, activists in favor of social housing. The Caravan Against Torture is a prominent example. Idle No More is another example, being labeled terrorist. So I really have a problem with that being done in secret and being done outside of the protections of the legal order. I think the relevant question for the government is, why are the tools of law and order not sufficient to this problem? Why couldn't we say, well, let's treat this like any other criminal problem, rather than effectively declaring war on these organizations and giving them the status of military fighters, which has been tremendously helpful for them? Osama bin Laden, before he committed the 9/11 attack, stated that his goal was to draw the United States into a military confrontation with al-Qaeda that would elevate their status in the Middle East to the status of the opposition to the United States. Treating them like a military force, treating them as if they deserve to be the object of a declaration of war, is giving them a status that they don't deserve. But unfortunately, it's a dynamic that serves both them and the governments that pursue them.
Is that the same case with Daesh?
Well, we have to ask ourselves who has funded Daesh. There are really, really problematic links between various security services and Daesh. I think that the Canadian government should be asking itself, who is most effectively fighting Daesh, and why would we align ourselves with organizations that are fighting that effective opposition to Daesh. You can't have your cake and eat it too. If you're going to say that the Syrian government should be funded by organizations very close to al-Qaeda, at the same time that the Syrian government is the only effective opposition to Daesh, I really have a hard time taking seriously the proposition that either the American or the Canadian governments think that Daesh is a serious problem.
Professor Alford, what do you want people to understand from this book, Permanent State of Emergency, Unchecked Executive Power, and the Demise of Rule of Law?
The bottom line message is that we can never be complacent about our constitutional order. If we believe that legality and the accountability of government is something worth preserving, we have to fight for it. And when we see the government saying the courts have no role here, you shouldn't be able to bring a lawsuit challenging this conduct, any inquiry into our conduct should be secret and kept out of the public eye, the immediate question should be why. We demand the government justify that to us. We are the people. They are the government. In the state of emergency, the government says, we deserve all of the power because we can keep you safe. Question that premise if you believe that the constitutional order is worth protecting.
Professor Ryan Alford, thank you very much for this.
Thank you.